Hello, welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It is number 813 of the Little Blue Book series and is entitled Contemporary American Philosophers, Santayana, James, and Dewey, written by Will Durant, PhD. Now, this was copyrighted in 1925, so it is Contemporary American Philosophers according to 1925. This is part 3. We left off on page 26, and we are still reading about Santayana. Backpedal the sentence here. Let's see. To love one's country unless that love is quite blind and lazy must involve a distinction between the country's actual condition and its inherent ideal. And this distinction in turn involves a demand for changes and for effort. On the other hand, race patriotism is indispensable. Some races are obviously superior to others. A more thorough adjustment to the conditions of existence has given their spirit victory, scope, and a relative stability. Hence, intermarriage is perilous except between races of acknowledged equality and stability. The Jews and the Greeks, the Romans, the English, were never so great as when they confronted other nations, reacting against them, and at the same time perhaps adopting their culture. But this greatness fails inwardly whenever contact leads to amalgamation. The great evil of the state is its tendency to become an engine of war, a hostile fist shaken in the face of a supposedly inferior world. Santayana thinks that no people has ever won a war. Where parties and governments are had, as they are in most ages and countries, it makes practically no difference to a community apart from local ravages whether its own army or the enemy's is victorious in war. The private citizen in any event continues in such countries to pay a maximum of taxes and to suffer, in all his private interests, a maximum of vexation and neglect. Nevertheless, the oppressed subject will glow like the rest with patriotic ardor, and will decry as dead to duty and honor anyone who points out how perverse is this helpless allegiance to a government representing no public interest. This is rather extreme language for a philosopher, but let us have our Santayana unexpurgated. Often enough, he thinks conquest and absorption by a larger state is a step forward toward the organization and pacification of mankind. It would be a boon to all the world if all the world were ruled by some great power or group of powers, as all the world was once ruled by Rome, first with the sword and then with the word. The universal order once dreamt of and nominally almost established the empire of universal peace, all permeating rational art and philosophical worship, is mentioned no more. Those dark ages from which our political practice is derived had a political theory, which we should do well to study, for their theory about a universal empire and a Catholic Church was in turn the echo of a former age of reason, when a few men, conscious of ruling the world, had for a moment sought to survey it as a whole and to rule it justly. Perhaps the development of international sports may give some outlet to the spirit of group rivalry and serve in some measure as a moral equivalent for war, and perhaps the cross investments of finance may overcome the tendency of trade to come to blows for the markets of the world. Santayana is not so enamored of industry as Spencer was. He knows its militant as well as its pacific side, and all in all, he feels more at ease in the atmosphere of an ancient aristocracy than in the hum of a modern metropolis. We produce too much and are swamped with the things we make. Things are in the saddle and ride mankind, as Emerson put it. In a world composed entirely of philosophers, an hour or two a day of manual labor, a very welcome quality, would provide for material wants. England is wiser than the United States, for though she too is obsessed with the mania for production, she has, in at least a portion of her people, realized the value in the arts of leisure. He thinks that such culture as the world has known has always been the fruit of aristocracies. Civilization has hitherto consisted in the diffusion and dilution of habits arising in privileged centers. It has not sprung from the people. It has arisen in their midst by a variation from them, and it has afterward imposed itself on them from above. A state composed exclusively of such workers and peasants as make up the bulk of modern nations would be an utterly barbarous state. Every liberal tradition would perish in it, and the rational and historic essence of patriotism itself would be lost. The emotion of it, no doubt, would endure, for it is not generosity that the people lack. They possess every impulse. It is experience that they cannot gather, for in gathering it they would be constituting some higher organs that make up an aristocratic society. He dislikes the ideal of equality and argues with Plato that the equality of unequals is inequality. Nevertheless, he does not quite sell himself to aristocracy. He knows that history has tried it and found its virtues very well balanced, but its defects, that it closes career to unpedigreed talent, that it chokes the growth in all but a narrow line, or just those superiorities and values that aristocracy would, in theory, develop and use. It makes for culture, but also it makes for tyranny. The slavery of millions pays for the liberty of a few. The first principle of politics should be that a society is to be judged by the measure in which it enhances the life and capacities of its constituent individuals. But for the excellence of the typical single life, no nation deserves to be remembered more than the sands of the sea. From this point of view, democracy is a great improvement on aristocracy, but it too has its evils. Not merely is corruption and its incompetence, but worse, its own peculiar tyranny, the fetish of uniformity. There is no tyranny so hateful as a vulgar, anonymous tyranny. It is all-permeating, all-thwarting. It blasts every budding novelty and sprig of genius with its omnipresent and fierce stupidity. But Santayana despises above all the chaos and indecent haste of modern life. He wonders, was there not more happiness for men in the old Aristotelic doctrine that the good is not liberty, but wisdom, and contentment with one's natural restrictions? The classical tradition knew that only a few can win, but now that democracy has opened the great free-for-all, catch as catch can, wrestling match of laissez-faire industrialism, every soul is torn with climbing and no one knows content. Classes war against one another without restraint, and whoever is victorious in this struggle for which liberalism cleared the field will make an end of liberalism. This is the nemesis of revolutions too, that in order to survive they must restore the tyranny which they destroyed. Revolutions are ambiguous things. Their success is generally proportionate to their power of adaptation and to the real absorption within them of what they rebelled against. 1,000 reforms have left the world as corrupt as ever. For each successful reform has founded a new institution, and this institution has bred its new and congenial abuses. But what form of society, then, shall we strive for? Perhaps for none. There is not much difference among them. But if for any one in particular for democracy, this would be government by men of merit and honor. It would be an aristocracy, but not hereditary. Every man and woman would have an open road, according to ability, to the highest offices in the state, but the road would be closed to incompetence, no matter how richly furbished it might be with platitudes. The only equality subsisting would be equality of opportunity. Under such a government, corruption would be at a minimum, and science and the arts would flourish through discriminating encouragement. It would be just the synthesis of democracy and aristocracy which the world pines for in the midst of its political chaos today. Only the best would rule, but every man would have an equal chance to make himself worthy to be numbered among the best. It is, of course, Plato over again, the philosopher kings of the Republic, appearing inevitably on the horizon of every far-seeing political philosophy. The longer we think about these matters, the more surely we return to Plato. We need no new philosophy. We need only the courage to live up to the oldest and the best. Chapter 6. Comment. There is in all these pages something of the melancholy of a man separated from all that he loves and was accustomed to, a man directe, a Spanish aristocrat exiled to a middle-class America. A secret sadness sometimes breaks forth. That life is worth living, he says, is the most necessary of assumptions, and were it not assumed, the most impossible of conclusions. In the first volume of The Life of Reason, he talks of the plot and meaning of human life and history as the subject of philosophy. In the last volume, he wonders, is there any meaning or a plot? He has unconsciously described his own tragedy. There is tragedy in perfection, because the universe in which perfection arises is itself imperfect. Like Shelley, Santayana has never felt at home on this middling planet. His keen aesthetic sense seems to have brought to him more suffering from the ugliness of things than delight in the scattered loveliness of the world. He becomes at times bitter and sarcastic. He has never caught the hearty cleansing laughter of paganism, nor the genial and forgiving humanity of Renan or Anatole France. He stands aloof and superior, and therefore alone. What is the part of wisdom, he asks, and answers, to dream with one eye open, to be detached from the world without being hostile to it, to welcome fugitive beauties and pity fugitive sufferings, without forgetting for a moment how fugitive they are. But perhaps this constant memento mori is a knell to joy. To live, one must remember life more than death. One must embrace the immediate and actual thing as well as the distant and perfect hope. The goal of speculative thinking is none other than to live as much as may be in the eternal, and to absorb and be absorbed in the truth. But this is to take philosophy more seriously than even philosophy deserves to be taken. And a philosophy which withdraws one from life is as much awry as any celestial superstition in which the eye, wrapped in some vision of another world, loses the meat and wine of this one. Wisdom comes by disillusionment, says Santayana, but again, that is only the beginning of wisdom, as doubt is the beginning of philosophy. It is not also the end and fulfillment. Is it not also the end and fulfillment? The end is happiness, and philosophy is only a means. If we take it as an end, we become like the Hindu mystic, whose life purpose is to concentrate upon his navel. Perhaps Santayana's conception of the universe as merely a material mechanism has something to do with this sombre withdrawal into himself. Having taken life out of the world, he seeks for it in his own bosom. He tests that it is not so, and though we may not believe him, his too much protesting disarms us with its beauty. A theory is not an unemotional thing. If music can be full of passion merely by giving form to a single sense, how much more beauty or terror may not a vision be pregnant with which brings order and method into everything that we know? If you are in the habit of believing in special providences, or of expecting to continue your romantic adventures in a second life, materialism will dash your hopes most unpleasantly, and you may think for a year or two that you have something left to live for. But a thorough materialist, one born to the faith and not half plunged into it by an unexpected christening in cold water, will be like the superb Democritus, a laughing philosopher. His delight in a mechanism that can fall into so many marvelous and beautiful shapes, and can generate so many exciting passions, should be of the same intellectual quality as that which the visitor feels in a museum of natural history, where he views the myriad butterflies in their cases, the flamingos and shellfish, the mammoths and gorillas. Doubtless there were pangs in that incalculable life, but they were soon over, and how splendid meantime was the pageant, how infinitely interesting the universal interplay, and how foolish and inevitable those absolute little passions. But perhaps the butterflies, if they could speak, would remind us that a museum, like a materialist philosophy, is only a showcase of lifeless things, that the reality of the world eludes these tragic preservations and resides again in the pangs of passion, in the ever-changing and never-ending flow of life. Santayana, says an observant friend, had a natural preference for solitude. I remember leaning over the railing of an ocean liner anchored at Southampton and watching passengers from the English tender crowd up the gangplank in the steamer. One only stood apart at the edge of the tender, with calm and amused detachment, observed the haste and struggle of his fellow passengers, and not till the deck had been cleared, followed himself. Who could it be but Santayana? A voice said beside me, and we all felt the satisfaction of finding a character true to himself. After all, we must say just that, too. Of his philosophy. It is a vicarious and fearless self-expression. Here a mature and subtle, though too somber, soul has written itself down quietly in statuesque and classic prose. And though we may not like its mirror key, its undertone of sweet regret for a vanquished world, we see in it the finished expression of this dying and nascent age, in which man cannot be altogether wise and free, because they have abandoned their old ideals and have not yet found the new ones that shall lure them nearer to perfection. Number 2, Chapter 1, William James. Personal. The reader will not need to be reminded that the philosophy which we have just summarized is a European philosophy in everything but the place of its composition. It has the nuances and polish and mellow resignation characteristic of an old culture. One could tell from any paragraph in the Life of Reason that this is no native American voice. In William James, the voice and the speech and the very turn of phrase are American. He pounced eagerly upon such characteristic expressions as cash value and results and profits, in order to bring his thoughts within the ken of the man in the street. He spoke not with the aristocratic reserve of Santayana or a Henry James, but in a racy vernacular, and with a force and directness which made his philosophy of pragmatism and reserve energy the mental correlate of the political and strenuous Roosevelt. And at the same time, he phrased for the common man that tender-minded trust in the essentials of the old theology, which lives side by side in the American soul, with the realistic spirit of commerce and finance, and with the tough, persistent courage that turned a wilderness into the promised land. William James was born in New York City in 1842. His father was a Scandinavian mystic, whose mysticism did no damage to his wit and humor, and the son was not lacking in any of the three. After some seasons in American private schools, William was sent with his brother Henry, 1 year his junior, to private schools in France. There they fell in with the work of Charcot and other psychopathologists, and took both of them a turn to psychology. One of them, to repeat an old phrase, proceeded to write fiction like psychology. Fiction like psychology, while the other wrote psychology like fiction. Henry spent most of his life abroad and finally became a British citizen. Through his more continuous contact with European culture, he acquired a maturity of thought which his brother missed. But William returned to live in America, felt the stimulation of the nation, young in heart and rich in opportunity and hope, and caught so well the spirit of his age and place that he was lifted on the wings of the zeitgeist to a lonely pinnacle of popularity such as no other American philosopher had ever known. He took his M.D. at Harvard in 1870 and taught there from 1872 to his death in 1910. At his Anatomy and Physiology, and then Psychology, and at last Philosophy, his greatest achievement was almost his first, The Principles of Psychology, 1890, a fascinating mixture of anatomy, philosophy, and analysis. For in James, psychology still drips from the photomembranes of its mother, metaphysics, yet the book remains the most instructive and easily the most absorbing summary of its subject. Something of the subtlety which Henry put into his clauses helped William James to the keenest introspection which psychology had witnessed since the uncanny clarity of David Hume. This passion for illuminating analysis was bound to lead James from psychology to philosophy, and at last back to metaphysics itself. He argued against his own positivist inclinations that metaphysics is merely an effort to think things out clearly, and he defined philosophy in his simple and pellucid manner as only thinking about things in the most comprehensive possible way. So after 1900 his publications were almost all in the field of philosophy. He began with The Will to Believe, 1897. Then, after a masterpiece of psychological interpretation, Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902. He passed on to his famous books on pragmatism, 1907, A Pluralistic Universe, 1909, and The Meaning of Truth, 1909. A year after his death came Some Problems of Philosophy, 1911, and later an important volume of essays in Radical Empiricism, 1912. We must begin our study with this last book, because it was in these essays that James formulated most clearly the basis of his philosophy. And I think we'll stop there.